What's good, everybody? Welcome to Grand Theories, Episode 6. I am your host, Mark. This is a podcast where we explore lesser-known ideas that try to explain really big things about the world we live in. A couple things before we get started this month. Firstly, if you're a fan of the show, it would be huge if you're able to rate and review on Apple, Spotify, or whatever platform you're on. From what I understand, these go a really long way in creating more exposure for the show. And secondly, if you're not already following me on social media, the links to my Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook are in the show notes. I post info about what I'm reading, stuff I find interesting, and try and give little previews of forthcoming shows. Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So, if there's one thing in philosophy, science, or just anywhere that I find the most perplexing or confusing, it would have to be time. What is time? How do you grasp time? On the surface, it seems that time could refer to several things. On one end, and perhaps as we think of it most frequently, time is something that we use to manage our lives. It's an organized system based on the objective motion of celestial bodies like the sun, moon, and even our own Earth. It transcends language, allowing our species to function, collaborate, and ultimately run our world. As useful as this isn't quite the understanding of time that we'll be primarily talking about today. Instead, we'll be talking about time as an object, as a thing. The type of time that physicists like Newton, Einstein, and Hawking grappled with in their work. The time that feels like it passes by, that flies as we're having fun. Well, what is it that this time is, exactly? As we talk about it, it seems to be some sort of object. It can move, pass, slog on. Depending on how things are going, it can seem to slow down or speed up. When we're sleeping or just otherwise distracted, we can even lose sense of time. But what is it exactly? We can't see it, touch it, or feel it. We can kind of sense it, I guess. But is there anything objective about that? One person can feel like time is moving pretty slow, yet it's perfectly reasonable that someone with them might feel that time is just passing normally. How do we make sense of this? Well, this is where Albert Einstein comes into our story. These days, most of our knowledge about time belongs to the domain of science, and physics in particular. And we could argue that the biggest single contributor to time theory would be Einstein himself. Albert Einstein's famous relativity formulas reveal that time does in fact move at different rates depending on how fast someone is moving compared with others. What do I mean here? Well, let's consider a car traveling on a highway. Let's say you're in the car and you're moving at the pretty standard rate in the US of 60 miles an hour. Now imagine another car in the lane next to you traveling at the exact same speed of 60 miles an hour. If you glance over at the car and you're both able to maintain that speed for any amount of time, it should look like the other car isn't moving at all. We may all be accustomed to this seeming illusion, but Einstein's formula reveals a deeper reality about it. It reveals that it's not an illusion at all, purely because motion is relative. A fellow 60-mile-per-hour car next to yours will just look like it's still. But to a hitchhiker standing on the side of the road, that 60-mile-per-hour car is going to look like a car that's going, 60 miles per hour. And to a car that's on the other side of the highway doing 60 in the opposite direction, that car will look twice as fast. So on one hand, this shows us that the speed of a car is ultimately based on the reference of someone stationary. But on a deeper level, this shows us that concepts like speed are purely subjective. They depend completely on what's observing it. Now, this thought experiment is a neat way to simplify Einstein's work pretty heavily. But what does any of this have to do with time? Well, as it turns out, just like motion, the way that time passes is relative as well. The reason for this is that time itself is melded into the fabric of space, and it's essentially inseparable from space. This is something we'll touch more on later. What we need to understand now is how time and speed relate to each other. As it goes, as your speed increases, time will slow down. Now, this is technically true when we move at any speed, but the effect is negligible and undetectable at any speed we can achieve here on Earth. You're going to have to move a lot faster than a Concorde or a fighter jet before you start noticing time slowing down. You'll have to get a little bit closer to the speed of light. So as it goes, the closer to the speed of light that something is moving, the slower that time moves for that object. So if you were in a spaceship that was somehow traveling near light speed, everything for you personally inside the spaceship would seem perfectly normal. Everything would be functioning as it should, just like it does when you're traveling in a car at 60 miles an hour. Your clocks and everything else in the cockpit would be moving at the pace that you expect them to. Now imagine that somehow some motionless people on Earth were able to watch you travel in that spaceship. Let's say they have a really high-powered telescope that can get a good view of you and the contents of your spaceship as you're racing through space. If these motionless folks were able to zoom in and see the clock on the wall of the cockpit of the spaceship, they would see it moving really, really, really slowly. To them, everything inside your ship would be moving slowly. And this is in spite of the fact that everything else around them on Earth would be moving perfectly normally. And for you, everything is still perfectly normal in the spaceship. So what this balances out to is that time for you in that ship is moving at a slower pace than for your earthly brethren, even though it feels normal for everybody. The kicker here is that it's entirely possible that if you were zooming around in that spaceship for, say, 3 years before returning to Earth, that you'll arrive to find that, say, 10 years passed here since you were gone. Now, there's no real easy way to explain why this is other than, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that Einstein's math shows that time is inextricably tied to space, motion, and gravity. So to answer my earlier questions, time isn't some sort of abstract concept that we can't grasp. Instead, it's an actual thing that is a physical part of our universe. And as alluded to earlier, we have no real frame of reference for this because our low-speed lives are all but free of the effects of time's strange higher-speed qualities. And the point here is to show you that time is far deeper than meets the eye. And the more you start to think about it, the less sense it seems to make. And in the world of philosophy, this is the perfect set of conditions to make something worth philosophizing about. There are a lot of very puzzling questions that you can ask about time philosophically. Like, does a second feel the same to everyone? I mean, we all know how long a second lasts. Many of us can look at a clock and agree on the fact that one tick of the second hand is in fact 1 second. But how long does that second really feel? To take Einstein's ideas out of it, Imagine that two people are standing in the same room, stationary. Their relative motion is the same. As they both stare at the clock and notice a second tick away, does that second feel as long as it does for person A as for person B? What about the present moment? Are we all in the same present moment right now? Meaning that as I walk around the world and among other people, are all those other people consciously in that moment with me? Or is their consciousness somewhere else up or down the timeline? Perhaps they're at some point in years past, or somewhere deep in the future. These types of anomalies have given philosophers of time a lot to ask, wonder, and think about. The literature on this subject is pretty rich historically. Many of the greats have chimed in one way or the other, and because of that, frankly, there isn't enough time to give due to all of those who deserve it in just one episode. But there is one person who we should definitely take a few moments to talk about. A philosopher whose work has been shaping debates about time for well over 100 years since he wrote about it. In 1908, John McTaggart Ellis McTaggart published a paper called The Unreality of Time. In his paper, McTaggart presents three possible ways that time could be structured. In the first way, which he calls the ESeries, time is much like most of us understand it in our day-to-day lives. ESeries time, of course, has a present moment, a now, which we are always in. The now moves or flows from moment to moment for each of us. As these nows pass us by, they enter and permanently become part of the past. The ESeries also contains a future that's filled with nows that have yet to come. And even though the past and the future are an important part of what makes up the ESeries, the present moment seems to be paramount. Even though we can think of the past and the future, we can only truly visit them when they're here, in the now. On the other hand, the B-series is a description of time in its objective, physical sense. In the B-series, time can still be understood as a sequence of events. Like the A-series, there's still an order to when things take place, a sense of before and after. World War I, for example, took place before the Second World War. This is just as true in the B-series as it is in the A-series. Now let's hope this never happens, but if there were a World War III, it would without a doubt take place after World War II. Again, A and B are the same in this regard, but where the B-series diverges is that there is no real present moment. There is no now. Instead, time is more akin to a static, unmoving timeline, a timeline we can step back from and view in all its completeness at any time. A timeline where no one moment has any particular privilege over another for any reason. Our perception, our subjective experience of time, is not a part of the B-series. In this view, instead, everything that has and will ever happen throughout time already physically exists. It's all already out there, stretched out, fused together with the space that makes up our universe. Perhaps this concept of a B-series seems personally meaningless to a lot of us in how we experience time. And this is a point we're going to explore throughout this episode. But the truth is, the B-series lines up very neatly with how modern-day science understands time. We saw this just a few minutes ago with Einstein's theory of relativity, which shows that time can pass at different rates for different beings, meaning that the present moment isn't some completely objective thing that every being necessarily has to experience at the same time. In fact, the math that underlies not only relativity, but physics in general, has no need for a present moment or for a now. In the halls of modern science, Our human experience of time is simply another subjective element of our consciousness. Compared to the more intuitive A-series, a B-series of time is really hard to create an image of. To help us with this, we can call upon a metaphorical concept called the block universe. Imagine the universe as a giant block. Within that block is not only everything that exists in our universe right now, but all of the different arrangements of our universe at all of its different times. So essentially it contains everything in every moment that has ever occurred and ever will occur. Okay, so now imagine the entirety of our universe right now in this one moment as one very thin sliver that makes up a part of the block. So one moment in time is essentially one unit in this block universe. And as we stack each unit on top of one another in order, it will begin to form a literal block shape. How long this block extends on for depends on whether or not you think time extends infinitely, or it has a defined beginning and end. There are people on both sides of that argument, but the ultimate point here is that the block universe helps us picture a physical version of time. Even though the B-series jives well with a lot of concepts in physics, McTaggart had a serious philosophical problem with it. It doesn't explain how we experience time, which McTaggart still considers quite important. See, in the B-series, time is a thing. In the A-series, however, time is largely an experience. In the A-series, there doesn't necessarily have to be any sort of block universe as I've defined it. Most of us are probably more attuned to the A-series, and McTaggart believes that we have no choice but to take that very seriously. To ignore our experience of time isn't really meaningful in trying to understand it, using a mind that's tuned for time. However, according to McTaggart, the A-series in its own merit isn't much better. It's filled with absurdities, enough absurdities to discredit it outright. One of McTaggart's key points is that in an A-series, every event in time is at some point part of the past, part of the present, and part of the future. So World War II at this moment is technically part of the past. But for those that lived through it both on and off the battlefield, many parts of World War II were part of the present. And for those that lived through the First World War, World War II was at one point part of a distant, unimaginable future. When we break it down like this, we can see this as a really inefficient and confusing way to try to understand time. In the A-series, every single moment technically possesses three different qualities, three different ways of understanding and describing them. In philosophy or science, this type of unneeded complication can be a death sentence for an idea. Why do we need to understand something three different ways? This is like having three different bosses when only one will suffice. There's no need to get so convoluted with anything when we can explain it in a simpler manner. And in this case, the A-series loses out to the B-series. McTaggart's work here created a great schism in the philosophy of time. Many sided with either the A-series or the B-series in what would become a theoretical battle for many years into the future, up to today. A-theorists present many arguments for why they think the flow of time is real. Some take the position that time does in fact objectively move. Some have presented their version of the block universe called the growing block universe, where instead of all moments in time already existing, only the past and present really exist. As time passes, the block grows and adds more slivers to the ever-increasing stack. B-theorists, on the other hand, will typically appeal to established work in science, such as Einstein's special relativity formulas. The irony here is that McTaggart himself fell on neither side of this argument. He instead offered a third way to understand time: the C-Series. When McTaggart first put forward the C-Series in his 1908 paper, he didn't spend too much time on it. Throughout his career, he continued to refine and revise the C-Series in his later works. You could go on at length about what he did with it, but we can simply sum up the C-Series as this: time has nothing but an order. As in, you can have a timeline where you have the Big Bang on one end, a whole bunch of stuff in the middle, and the end of the universe on the far end. And that's about it. There's no flow of time in this series. There's not even a real direction that time is supposed to move in. See, in the B-Series, even though there's no now, events still occur earlier than or later than, or even at the same time as, other events. There's a before and an after. But in the C-Series, direction is no longer sacred. For us, the Big Bang is the beginning of the universe. It's the earliest event that there is. In the C-Series, the Big Bang could either be the beginning or the end of the universe, depending on the perspective you take. As I'd mentioned, most philosophers of time support either the A or B series. Comparatively few could be considered C theorists. They're pretty rare, but they are out there. Matt Farr is a contemporary British philosopher who puts himself square in the C theory camp. Now, before we talk about his argument about why time has no flow or no direction, Farr openly states that we are time-centric beings. As we perceive it in our minds, time moves, and it moves forward, and we really can't argue against this. This is how we experience time through every single day that we spend in this life. But this doesn't stop Farr from advocating for the idea that time doesn't need a direction in order to explain and understand it. To get where he's coming from, we need to talk about something called time symmetry. For some physical process or action to be time symmetric means that it could happen in reverse, and none of the laws of physics would technically be violated. There are a huge number of everyday processes in our world that qualify for this. Water flowing through a pipe, for example, is just one of them. With that said, for an event to be time asymmetric means that, as you can probably guess, if we did somehow reverse time, that action would violate the laws of physics. So, for example, as we all know, if you leave a cup of coffee out for any length of time, it will inevitably cool to room temperature. This is a basic manifestation of the second law of thermodynamics. This law is a statistical phenomenon, which more or less governs how energy transfer works in the grand scheme of our universe. I am deeply simplifying this law, but we're all quite familiar with many of its day-to-day effects. If you step outside on a really cold winter day in a t-shirt, your body is inevitably going to give off and lose some of its heat. This is crudely a product of the second law, and processes like these are all time asymmetric. It would be inconceivable, for example, for your cup of coffee to suddenly warm up while just sitting there on your table. Truths like the second law of thermodynamics are among the reasons why time is considered to have a specific forward direction in the first place. There are a variety of things that simply just can't happen in the other direction, and this seems to rule out being able to reverse time altogether. None of this, however, stops Farr from putting forward C theory as the best way to understand time. For one, we certainly don't need a direction to talk about time-symmetric processes. We can talk about those in reverse and just be done with it. As for time-asymmetric processes, Farr reasons that we're also able to describe these in the other direction. Now, he admits that it's a lot easier if you do it in the quote-unquote right way. For example, if you're describing a cup of coffee cooling in reverse, you're going to have to add some extra language and structure to make your case. But the point here is that it can be done. Farr holds that the directionless ESeries is the best and most proper way to understand time. As he argues, if time doesn't need a specific direction in these descriptions, then time really doesn't need a direction at all. Now, this may startle our intuition, but let's dig a little deeper into this. Let's say you walked into a room and saw an old VHS tape being rewound on a TV screen. No matter what the movie or show is, you wouldn't need to specifically know that the tape was being rewound in order to know that it just looks off. As Farr and many other philosophers believe, time and its forward direction is built into us as essentially another one of our senses. With that said, you could look at the screen with the rewinding tape and likely very quickly infer that the tape is moving backwards. But just because our default setting is to understand time as moving forward, doesn't mean we can't technically watch time move backwards and get all the same information about what's happening. Sure, it might be a little harder, might take a little longer. Learning to understand the spoken word backwards would certainly take some effort. This wouldn't be a fun exercise at all, but the point is that it can be done. We have all the information we need no matter which way the tape goes. If either C theory, or even B theory for that matter, are accurate, then our perception of time is a clear distortion of its true nature. In terms of how they perceive time, our brains would clearly be some type of filter, sifting through and delivering the information encoded in the structure of time in a manner that our conscious minds can handle. This idea happens to align with the work of none other than Immanuel Kant, who a bit under 250 years ago put forward that the world that exists outside of our human perceptions could in fact be completely at odds with how we experience it. To exemplify this, all we have to do is ponder the ways that different animals see the world. Flies seem to capture images in a series of distorted hexagons that creates a spatial sense that differs greatly from ours. Snakes can see things in temperature. Bats can't really see much of anything visually, but instead use sound to create images of the world around them. The point here is that our individual understanding of the world around us is vulnerable to the nature of the hardware and processes that allow our minds to work. Our relationship with and understanding of space, for example, is completely different to that of a fly. And the fact is, the world as it actually is, a Kantian world, may in fact be vastly different than how our filters interpret it. So with that said, our internal hardware may lead us to experience time inaccurately. There are piles and piles of ideas that help to suggest this in both science and philosophy. On the scientific side, we can sum this up with an interesting 2013 paper that suggests that both an animal's size and metabolism help to determine how quickly or slowly time passes for that animal. In the paper, the authors put forward evidence regarding how different animals, including humans, perceive flashing light. Take a strobe light, for example. When a strobe light is moving slowly enough, you'll notice it as successive flashes that occur periodically. You can jack up the speed a little bit and you still may notice the individual flashes, but it all starts to merge together a bit, and it gets a hair tougher to differentiate. Eventually, you'll hit a certain point where the flashes are happening so quickly, you'll no longer notice the difference. You just see it as one beam of light. Well, there's neurological evidence to suggest that that critical point varies among species. Animals that are smaller with faster metabolisms can differentiate between the flashes at higher speeds than larger animals. So what this means in essence is that for animals like hummingbirds or flies, time moves slower. And this makes sense evolutionarily because smaller animals are more than likely going to have a large number of predators and other dangers to worry about. To be able to see time more slowly means that you can react more quickly to attacks and ultimately survive. This is great for the little guys, but the ultimate point here is that even when everything is equal, when we're all moving at the same speed and looking at the same things, the flow of time is still subjective. For people, the rate at which time flows can easily be affected by brain injuries, age, being stressed out, being especially happy or sad, and even our body temperature. Our personal understanding of time is nothing sacred. This is a check mark for the B series, but what about the C series? Can people perceive the direction of time differently? Well, in one sense, yes, they can. For one, different cultures can perceive the shape of time in varying ways. For most native English speakers, which I believe is a large number of people who listen to this podcast, time is generally thought of as running left to right, from past to future. Just imagine any standard timeline that you've seen portrayed in textbooks or magazines or wherever. More than likely, those timelines are meant to be read from left to right, with the point furthest in the past being placed on the left, and the future extending out to the right. In English, time can also be portrayed as behind or in front of us. So you might hear the phrase, "I'm glad that's behind me," meaning that some series of unpleasant moments is now in the past. Or likewise, you may hear the sage-like statement, "There's a lot of life in front of you," meaning that there's plenty of fortune and good waiting for you in the future. English is loaded with these types of directional references to time. Things get more interesting as we begin to explore how time appears to those with other lingual capabilities. Before we dive into that, let's briefly touch on an idea in cognitive science called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis itself is pretty complex, but very basically, the idea entails that the structure of the language or languages that we understand ultimately shapes how we perceive the world around us. In this regard, the structure and range of our language can both limit and expand how we interpret our surroundings. This may sound a bit abstract, so let's give a couple of examples here. I'd mentioned that English speakers tend to view time as moving from left to right. Well, according to a 2010 paper, native Mandarin speakers tend to think of time as moving vertically, as opposed to in a horizontal direction. Intuitively, we may imagine that this is because Mandarin can be written vertically. But the paper instead pinpoints the fact that in Mandarin, two words very commonly used to refer to the past and future are sha, which means down, and shang, which means up. Many of the time-related phrases and sayings in Mandarin incorporate these words, thus shaping time's subjective direction for those speakers. Things get more interesting as we shift to the Yupno people of Papua New Guinea. For the Yupno, time does not move along a completely vertical or horizontal plane. time instead moves along the contours of the mountains of their native lands. So in this case, the future is uphill, extending to the top of the mountains, while the past lives downhill towards the river. Time also has a different geometry for the Yupno. In English, timelines are generally portrayed using straight lines. For the Yupno, this isn't the case. Time instead moves along the natural crags, protrusions, dips, and contours contained within their landscape. Finally, let's talk about the case of the Aymara people of northern Chile. In their culture, the past is generally thought of as being in front of us, as opposed to at our backs. So as we are looking toward the future, the Aymara look toward the past. Anthropologist Rafael Núñez highlights the etymology of the terms for past and future to help explain this. The word naira, which can mean front or eye, is often used in expressions referring to the past. Meanwhile, the word kipa, which means back or behind, is associated with the future. On top of this, Núñez and his co-author hypothesized that another important reason for this is the Aymara's strong emphasis on direct vision as a source of knowledge. In that case, we can certainly know the past with certainty, but can't really know the future in this way. It therefore makes a lot of sense for the future to be positioned behind us, where we can't see it. These cultural examples differ slightly from C-Theory's core idea, which is that we don't need to think directionally at all. The previous example suggests that even though some people may have different understandings of the direction that time moves in, at least some direction still seems to exist for all of us. And all of these experiences we've highlighted still revolve around there being a present moment, something that plays into a theory. However, it's pretty clear that what time feels like is a malleable concept, a concept prone to our physical composition, capabilities, and life experiences. And what time feels like seems to be, at least in the case of humanity, just as important as its objective physical qualities. Can there really be a theory of time that doesn't take any of this into account? How meaningful would that really be? At the end of the day, Matt Farr's reading on C-Theory is a physical explanation of time. It doesn't really take into account some of these subjective qualities that we've discussed. But could it be that C-Theory could explain this side of time as well? Earlier in the episode, we talked a little bit about why time moves forward in the first place. We had mentioned that the second law of thermodynamics is thought to be one of the main reasons for this. Another idea here is that of cause and effect. So in terms of time, an event is any one thing that happens. For example, taking a single step is an event. Events are thought to be always caused by something that happened in the past. So when you take a step, what causes that? Well, ultimately, some type of process in your brain triggers a series of physical reactions in your body that lead you to take that step. So in this case, all the causes of that single step happened before the step took place. When we think of it this way, it therefore sounds absurd to say that something that happens in the future can cause something in the past to change. A 2019 study by Naoki Nomura and a group of researchers challenges this notion. In their paper, Nomura and friends touch on the idea of retrocausality. Retrocausality is a pattern of cause and effect, where some action or event causes a change to happen in the past. This may seem like a strange idea, but there actually is evidence that it's occurred in the realm of particle physics. This evidence has been famously found in something called the quantum eraser experiment, where some interpretations of the results suggest that the behavior of photons was actually caused by an observation that occurred after that behavior took place to begin with. This is a really complicated experiment, and if you want more information about it, I've dropped a link in the show notes to both the original study and a helpful explanation on YouTube by the good folks at PBS. We can also find hints of retrocausality in the macro world. The solutions to some of Einstein's relativity formulas contain retrocausal phenomena in which time would loop in on itself. To see these in the real world would require some pretty exotic situations, things like moving through a wormhole. And as far as we know, there's no evidence of anything like this ever occurring. But in the Nomura study, the authors suggest that retrocausal stuff happens all the time. Take the sport of tennis, for example. One of the most important skills in tennis is being able to react quickly and accurately to your opponent. At the highest levels, tennis moves so quickly that players must be able to predict and anticipate what their opponents are going to do in order to even have enough time to position themselves for successful return shots. In a sense, we can say that tennis players must be able to accurately depict the future in their minds, and then use that information about the future to make adjustments to their current actions. The more accurately a tennis player anticipates their opponent's future state, the higher the likelihood the success of the return shot. In a certain sense, the arrow of time is moving from future to past here. Events in the future are directly causing the actions of the player. And per the Nomura study, this type of reverse causation is ever present in our world. In nature, a dragonfly chasing a mosquito, for example, is almost a purely reactive process. Both the mosquito and the dragonfly are constantly anticipating and adjusting to the other's predicted actions. This creates an endless feedback loop which ultimately entails a chase scene that is determined entirely by the future. This is just one example of many that can occur in nature. Nomura and friends use these examples to put forward an idea that time isn't a purely mental or physical process. It's an ecological one. Time is cooperative. Time exists through communication and signaling between organisms. It can flow either way, forward or backward. Organisms are able to understand, use, and keep track of time simply through synchronizing with other organisms around us. In this case, time is collaborative and subjective. It emerges through our interactions with the things around us. And this is called the ESeries of time. The Nomura paper uses mostly non-human examples. At this point, how do we explain time for us? In the Nomura paper, the ESeries relies on organisms working with those in their immediate surroundings to create time. Human society has arguably expanded well beyond this. We keep track of time not only in our minds, but using objective, globally accepted timekeeping standards. We don't only rely on local cues to know which point in time we're at. An ESeries would be incomplete for our purposes. But what the Nomura paper has shown is that time's direction is muddled and context-dependent. The arrow of time can move either way, subjectively. And I would argue that this is accurate for us, too. When we take a car in for an oil change, we're essentially doing so because we want to avoid a future where we didn't take our car in for one. When we take painstaking actions like studying for a test or completing a job application, we do so because of a future state that those actions would lead to. In these cases, the anticipated future is causing the past. On top of this, one general piece of advice that just about everyone has heard is to set big goals, to develop a vision of a future life that we'd like to live, and to use that vision to work backwards to set milestones, using those milestones to set action steps, and then to get up every day and to make as much progress on those steps as possible, no matter how small or incremental they might feel. If one is motivated enough, they can devote essentially their entire lives to achieving one specific future state. Without going one by one through all the other possible examples, my point here is that in many ways as humans, we are very much caused by the future. Now, in this sense, the past is no doubt still very important. The past certainly influences us. We constantly learn from which mistakes not to repeat, or draw motivation from key high or low points. The past certainly affects the future, there's no doubt. But as we've just seen, the future also has a great effect. We could argue about which is more important, but the point here is that the direction of time, in a subjective sense, is now very unclear. C theory seems to have some space here. And so far, we've really only talked about how time is experienced here on Earth. In the grandest sense, Earth is a very, very specific environment, in a very specific corner of a seemingly endless universe. In our little corner, there is admittedly rich diversity in the ways that life can be composed. Compare a jellyfish to a human, or a falcon to a sponge, and it quickly becomes clear that there's plenty more than one recipe for success here on our planet. And based on what we've just discussed, that diversity exists in regard to how we perceive time. And that's really only among humans. Even though time might move significantly slower for a hummingbird, we really don't know what it feels like for them. And what about for a sponge? Does a sponge feel time at all? And to take this to a logical conclusion, if we think what life might be like in a distant supercluster, we probably imagine that it could and would be a lot different than anything we've ever seen before. Different conditions demand different lines of specialization, different qualities to thrive. Earth, and particularly the natural Earth, is a quick-moving place. Not anticipating a dangerous future event in time, say a stalking predator, can spell quick doom for many species. Therefore, our future-oriented perception of time seems natural. In that case, is it possible to imagine planets where this type of competitive survival isn't necessary? Where some other sense of time might thrive? Can we imagine extraterrestrial life that perceives time in a completely different way? This idea was explored in a 2016 film called Arrival. Very broadly, this movie is about a global reaction to the arrival of several extraterrestrial spaceships to various points on Earth. The protagonist, a highly regarded American linguist played by Amy Adams, is sent to try to communicate with the aliens. She's able to do so, and in her interactions with them, Adams' character is able to obtain the ability to perceive time as the alien species does. For them, time is nonlinear and directionless. They don't really feel time at all. The aliens instead are able to see the entirety of time, spanning from past to future at any one moment. And it's not really accurate to even say at any one moment here, because the aliens aren't really in any moment at all. They're always aware of all of time. In the plot, this capability is explained using the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that I mentioned earlier. The idea that our language informs our perceptions. The idea in Arrival is that the aliens communicate using a circularly structured language, a language that completely forgoes the barriers that exist in our earthly minds, which cause us to view time from moment to moment. Because of their language, the aliens aren't capable of seeing time as having a direction at all. The idea of time and direction would be foreign to them. So in the film, by being given access to this written language, Adams is able to see not only her entire future, but the entire future of humanity. This new foresight leads Adams to make some major life decisions. Decisions she wouldn't have been able to make had she not been able to see the future in the first place. In this instance, Adams' future actions rippled backward through time to ultimately determine what happened in the past. The directionless, all-encompassing version of time portrayed in Arrival is the same version of time that C theory supports. Now, I understand that Arrival is merely a film, but I have to ask, is it really possible for any form of life to experience time in this way? Maybe. For one, some recent theoretical scientific work has suggested the possibility that when the universe formed during the Big Bang, a second universe formed as well, colloquially referred to as a mirror universe. This universe is in essence the exact same as ours, but time instead runs backwards. So it could be that there are other versions of us in this universe moving backwards through time. But even if this theory turns out to be true, chances seem pretty dim that we'd be able to experience it. On another hand, we can always point to future technologies perhaps being able to open up our experience of time. But this is a vague and pretty unsatisfying conclusion. As this podcast series goes on, I start to see more and more connection between the topics that we cover. Previous themes and threads and ideas continue to reemerge. These connections, in my mind at the least, help legitimize and breathe life into these heavy and abstract ideas. And in the case of being able to experience time in a true C series, it seems that there's at least one possible way we could do that in some sense right now. But to fully explore that possibility will require more than just the brief seconds I have left on this episode. We'll find out more next month on Grand Theories.